So I am Mark Michelson. I work at Red Hat. I primarily do OVN development. And I hope you guys don't mind me because you're going to be seeing me a lot here. It's this talk, and then I give the first two after lunch. So just bear with me as long as you can. So to start things off, I just want to see a quick show of hands. Who all in here regularly contributes to the OVS repo? Let's have a look. We got a lot fewer hands than I ever expected to see. Okay. And I guess how many people regularly contribute to OVN? We have one, we have two, three, four. Okay, an even smaller number. So here's the thing. When you hear something about an OVS-OVN split, those of you who regularly do contribute to OVS may find yourself saying, well, how does this affect me? And the thing is, it can. And it really needs input from everyone involved in order to make sure that we're going where we should be going. Now, as Ben suggested, this talk is not necessarily designed to be a full-fledged 20-minute speak-at-you type of thing. I'm only going to take up a little bit of the time to start with, and then we're going to open up the floor to discussion, questions, that sort of thing. I just wanted to present some slides to you just so you can get your brain working, understand where we're coming from, that sort of thing. So the very first question is, probably from anyone, say, why would we want to split OVN out from OVS? Well, one of the big things is we're starting to see that the two projects have different development paces. So in other words, OVN is getting adopted a lot more by large projects, and as a result, when it gets deployed, people are requesting more features, they're finding more bugs, that sort of thing. And so the result is they're wanting a quicker turnaround on these things than OVS, which is a lot more well-established. And the other part of that is that when they do request these bug fixes or these feature requests, a lot of times what they want to be able to do is strictly just upgrade their OVN installation to have those fixes or those new features without also having to pull in changes to OVS that they might not want to have. So then the other thing about it is I think the projects have very different target audiences. So for instance, if I go around and start talking to people here, I find that a lot of the regular OVS contributors are kernel developers, people who work for switch manufacturers and Intel and other hardware manufacturers, those sorts of things. And the OVN contributors are people like OpenStack developers, eBay is a big one, people who aren't necessarily directly involved in hardware development and such. Also, this is possibly jumping the gun a little bit here, but we're about to start seeing very different dependencies in the projects. In particular, OVN, we're going to be seeing potentially some reliance on Rust at runtime and Haskell and Rust at compile time, but that is a down the road sort of thing. So then the question becomes, how do we actually perform the split? So the goal of performing a split like this is that we want to make sure that OVN and OVS can actually just exist independently. So in other words, if you are running a version of OVS and you're running a different version of OVN, that should just work. And it also means that the dependencies that you have to have for OVN don't necessarily are the same dependencies that you need in order to build or run OVS. We also want to make sure that we can actually release new versions of OVN and OVS when it feels like we should. So in other words, right now, OVS sticks to a very strict schedule, and OVN sort of has to comply with that schedule as well. And it may be that, especially during this time of greater OVN adoption, we actually want to start releasing versions of OVN more rapidly. And right now, when you talk about version numbers of OVS and OVN, they're just one and the same, essentially. You don't really think about it too much. But what we would like to be able to do is have them diverge from each other and it not be an issue. And this is probably the biggest thing. We want to avoid pain during this OVN-OVS split. So in other words, we don't want to all of a sudden make it a hassle to try to build OVS or build OVN. We don't want to make anything more difficult to test. By God, we don't want to do that. And we don't want to make it difficult in order to maintain compatibility between the two. So this last bullet point just says we're probably going to be relying on things like the zero-day robot and other sorts of continuous integration to be finding issues early so we don't have to deal with them down the road. So let's actually talk about how the split gets performed. So this is a plan that was sort of floated out on the mailing list, the OVS dev mailing list, and I'll just say it didn't have any disapproval. It didn't really get a whole lot of traction from readers of the list. So we have a phase 1 that we will plan to have implemented by the time the OVS 2.11 release rolls around in early 2019. And so there's two parts to it. First of all, there is actually just package separation, which we'll talk about more in detail in the upcoming slides, and maintaining runtime compatibility between OVN and OVS. Phase 2, now this is the bigger one, but we want to try to also get it done for 2019, but for the 2.12 release later in the year. And that's going to involve the actual code separation and maintaining code compatibility. So as far as package separation is concerned, OVN currently exists as a sub-package of OVS. So what that means is you upgrade OVN, if you try to upgrade your OVN package, you're also going to upgrade your OVS package to the same version. And we want to not have that anymore because we have people who are wanting to upgrade one without the other. So as far as how that actually goes, it's a relatively straightforward task in this case. It's essentially taking the OVN portions of your spec files or your Debian package files or whatever, and essentially making that into its own separate package that can be updated independently. I mentioned here about static linking of libraries just as a way of saying that if you did compile a version of OVS and a different version of OVN, and there are common libraries that they both used and they changed between those versions, the static linking at build time should hopefully make it so that there is no issue attempting to run the disparate versions. Maintaining runtime compatibility is interesting in this case because, as I've said before, you could have a different version of OVN and a different version of OVS running. So you have to think about what might actually have changed when you have this sort of partial upgrade go on. And probably the biggest potential example is you have a mismatch in OpenFlow matches and actions. So the example there would be if OVN adds a new feature, and as part of that feature, it says, I need to create a brand new OpenFlow extension in OVS to be able to match on some new field. The result of that is, if someone comes along and runs that new version of OVN, but they haven't upgraded their OVS, that match or that action won't exist in the old OVS, so the OVN has to be prepared for that situation and still be able to run as well as it can. There's also potentially the issue of database fields, sort of the same situation. OVN creates a new database column or new database in the OVS vSwitch D tables, and the result is that a newer version of OVS expects something to be there, and an older version of OVS doesn't have it. So you just have to make sure that you're prepared for it. So the biggest thing that you have to be able to do is at runtime, there has to be some way that you can test whether a feature is present or not. Now, I mentioned this on the mailing list, and I might put Ben on the spot later for this, but Ben sort of mentioned that these actually might already be covered. It's just a matter, though, of making sure that we're actually diligent in OVN to make use of these methods of checking things so that going forward we don't find ourselves hitting awful regressions. So, as I said before, this is phase 1. I tend to think of this as being pretty uncontroversial as an idea in general, the idea being of just making a package separate. There's not a whole lot of ways you can screw that up, I don't think. And when you have that, the idea then is that you now have the ability going forward to have a separately installed package of OVN or OVS. So down the line, for instance, if someone really likes using OVS 2.11 and they want to use OVN 2.14 or whatever it may end up being called, they potentially should be able to do it. Now, we may institute some sort of rule at some point down the road that says we're only backwards compatible with 1 or 2 versions or something, but that's sort of a policy type decision for another time. The problem with this is you haven't actually given a way for OVN to release at a separate cadence from OVS still. They're still tied together intrinsically by being in the same repo and having the same build system. So now we move into what I feel like is the most controversial and has the most ways you could do this wrong section, which is code separation. So before you actually start talking about what you need to do, you have to look at what it is that OVS and OVN share between the two of them. So the biggest thing is C code, right? So I've listed several things here, like you just have common utilities, like they both use some same memory allocation calls. They use the same hash map library. They use the same packets.h and packets.c files for doing IP address manipulation, Ethernet address manipulation, that sort of thing. And one thing I didn't list on this slide, but I list later, is OVS DB. That's a really big common C dependency between the two of them. Outside of just the basic source code, you also have your test code. So for instance, there are common M4 functions that OVN tests and OVS tests use. There's common Python programs, and there's common, well, there used to be Perl programs. I think those are all gone now. But there are some C programs I think that both share. I wrote build utilities here. The biggest one that I could think of is check patch. It's just a script that both OVN and OVS contributors are going to want to use. And there may also be some documentation. I put it as a bullet point here, but that's sort of one of those, I'm not really sure. Oh, I see. I duplicated the slide like an idiot. All right, here we go. So we have some strategies for doing full code separation. So the first strategy here, I actually refer to it as full separation. So the whole idea here is that you have OVS and OVN living in completely separate repos from each other. And the thing about that is now you have to figure out a way to make the parts that they share reachable from both repos. So here's a strategy that I call the lots of get repos strategy. In other words, you have the OVS-C library, which has your common C library functions that both OVS and OVN use. You have an OVS test library that has the M4 functions, the test programs, etc. You have the OVS DB in a separate repo. Then you have the OVS repo itself, and you have the OVN repo. The thing about this is, from a pure don't repeat yourself point of view, this is probably what you would think of, except that it is probably going to be a nightmare to actually try to do anything with, because you would have to be separately versioning every single one of these repos, and trying to make sure that the interdependencies work would be problematic. Basically what I'm glad about is that when I presented this to you guys, you didn't immediately start throwing things at me, because it's kind of that bad an idea. Okay, so you can still do full separation of OVS and OVN into different repos, but maybe not go quite overboard with it. So maybe you have a C repo that includes the libraries and the OVS DB. You have a test repo that contains actual OVN tests and OVS tests, as well as their shared test resources. And then you have your OVS repo and your OVN repo. That seems a little bit less complicated, but you still have, the burden of potentially having to update multiple repos just to add a feature. So here's a weird idea. I call this the clones strategy. This is where you clone the OVS repo and you relabel it as OVN. And in the OVN repo, you remove all the OVS code. In the OVS repo, you remove all the OVN code. And both just have copies of all of the common code, the libraries, the OVS DB and stuff. It's definitely one of those things that you could get done in like a week. But you now have copies of everything between the two, and it's still kind of a bad idea, because you now have to potentially update multiple repos with the same changes, and if they get out of sync with each other, you're going to have all sorts of confusion. So then there's more of a logical separation idea. Again, I don't really know if this is doable, but the idea is you continue to just have one repo, and you have separate build systems for OVN and OVS, so that they could sort of just be divided into subfolders. The big issue here, though, is I'm not really sure how you would actually maintain multiple versions of the different projects with a single Git repo. Git may have some sort of tools for that, but if they are, they're in the dark corners of Git that I don't ever look in, so I don't really know anything about it. Again, I'm not really sure about this one. So this is one that I have a little bit more confidence in. The idea is a Git submodule strategy. So with this, you have OVS repo mostly stays exactly the same as it is. You just cut out the OVN stuff from it, and you cut that OVN stuff out and put it into a separate repo. That OVN repo then has OVS as a Git submodule. So OVN is still able to build using well-known locations of code and libraries and stuff within the OVS submodule. The only thing with this, of course, is that I've never had a lot of fun with Git submodules, so I have no idea exactly what we'd be looking at as far as maintenance burden is concerned. And I see some looks on people's faces that have a let's say they look scared. Anyways, moving on, part 4. I call this maintaining code compatibility. Essentially what I mean here is API compatibility. So in other words, at this point, now you start having issues where you are trying to compile against a target that is a version older than what you may have been compiling against before. So you have to make sure that you are prepared for in case, say, a function doesn't exist or a structure has changed sizes or something like that. So you just have to have safeguards in place, that sort of thing, in order to make sure that that's going to work. So for instance, you could have configure time checks for specific features or specific struct fields existing, that kind of thing, if you wanted to go really, I guess, micromanagey with it. Or a more general version of it would be to just have a compile time check to see what version of OVS that you're compiling against so that you can know what features will be present. But no matter how you do it, it takes discipline to maintain it. You actually have to make sure that you're doing what you can to maintain the API and ABI compatibility. Okay, so we have a little bit of time left. So this is now where I just say you can ask questions, you can give suggestions, you can do whatever you can, because right now, as you probably saw, when it comes to the code separation especially, there's a lot of ways you can do it and a lot of ways you can do it wrong, and probably every one of those that I just suggested is probably wrong in some way worse than some of the others. So I would say that even if we don't come to any conclusion here during this time, we should definitely keep the discussion going on the mailing list, because getting an idea of how we're going to actually go about doing a split is a good goal to have. Okay, so questions from the audience? I see you got them.
Yeah, do you think OVSDB server is the major challenge here? Because OVSDB server, OVS depends on it and OVN depends on it, right? So shouldn't we also, if we are going this path, we should also remove or separate OVSDB server from OVS and then have it to be a separate entity too, right? Because
yeah, so the question is about making OVSDB server a separate repo and a separate...
not in terms of code separation, in terms of release as well, right?
Oh,
because,
yes.
Because Raft, for example, might need more fixes, and then we cannot wait, OVN cannot wait for next release of OVS along with OVSDB server for us to get fix for Raft in OVN.
So in my view, the implication is if you separate something out from the main OVS and OVN repository, it's going to end up having its own independent versioning. So yes, if you moved OVSDB away, then you probably would end up having it maintaining its own versions as well.
I think it's necessary is what I'm saying. I think
yes. Okay.
Right, but the thing again is a lot of, that's one part. Another thing is we use a lot of OVS tools to monitor and debug OVN daemons. For example, OVS app kettle. OVS app kettle, you can say -t target OVN controller. We get so many things. Now OVS app kettle is part of OVS packaging, right? Now OVN is separate packaging. We go ahead. Now we need some fix in OVS app kettle. So how do you deliver OVS app kettle now?
Well, the one thing about the way OVS app kettle is coded is that if you are adding a new feature in OVN that OVS app kettle is going to use, it's dynamic enough to potentially find that new feature in OVN even if you haven't updated OVS in that case. But if you've actually updated OVS app kettle itself, and now you want to make sure that using that utility with OVN works. See, this is good. I'm glad we're having this discussion, because this is a really good point, because that's sort of a common tool that maybe also gets separated out from being OVS necessarily and becomes just part of the common set of libraries or tools or utilities that both repos pull from.
So we just now had 4 different releases: OVS, OVS DB server, OVS tools, Oven, and then we might be missing more. So my question to you is that why can't we do more point releases, 2.9.3, 2.9.4, 2.9.5, 2.9.6? I mean, why can't we release often these things as Oven release vehicle instead of having, I mean, code separation is its own bag of thing.
Okay, so the question is, why can't we just have more point releases?
Yes,
is the idea?
Yeah.
I mean, we could, and you, by doing that right now with the current setup, you would probably be bringing in fewer, I guess you'd call them rogue elements from parts you don't care about necessarily, but you still do have those. So in other words, even if you did release more often and it did have, this specific set of OVN bug fixes or features that you care about, there's a chance also that you're pulling in OVS features that or new bugs from it that you otherwise don't want to have to introduce. So yeah, like this is a tough problem. And I understand why this has sort of been one of those things that's been on the let's do this sometime down the road map. And then whenever anyone looks at it, they go, oh my gosh, this is real difficult. So like I said, I'm trying to mostly just open up the dialogue here, and I am perfectly fine continuing this either in person with everyone or on mailing lists or something, because you're bringing up very good points, and they definitely need to be addressed, because I'm not sure how you do this without making things difficult for people.
Yeah, one reason that I haven't started to debate this on the mailing list much is just every time I think about it, I freak out a little bit.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. Here's the thing, right? If there's a way to achieve the goals of a split without actually performing a split, then that's something that's also something to consider. It's just a matter of whether that's possible or not, right? So if that's something that we think we can achieve, I'm certainly willing to discuss that, and I'm pretty sure others would be too.
The thing that gives me the most confidence that a split is something we should actually do is that the people involved in the project don't intersect that much.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to agree with that. I think that you have different people, and really, the OVN is, we don't want to, as OVS developers, we don't want to be having a preference for a particular controller, or, they should be sort of independent. And the code development is actually very independent. Everything that is Oven specific is in the Oven directory. So there's nothing that's in OVN that has spilled out into OVS. The only issue is that OVN is dependent on OVS features, and it's really as a library and some of those utilities that you mentioned. But I do think that we need to figure out how to get OVN as a separate project. I think that is a good goal, but then in terms of how we do it, I think, yes, there are a lot of open questions, but I do think we should be keeping in mind that is our ultimate goal, break OVN out separately in some sort of sane way.
Okay.
And then one other thing I will say about if we were doing the, if we just continue to do, if we just released more versions of OVS for a particular problem, or for a particular, wanted to add new features to OVN, and then just did like a .z release to include those. We usually prefer not to do that. We try not to add new features to that kind of release, because what we always want those Z releases to be going towards more stability, so they should really just have bug fixes. If you start introducing features, then you could start introducing new bugs, and then it gives people less confidence about the release. So I think, it's a good idea, but I think that would be a reason not to follow that path.
Okay, Han?
Yeah, I think it makes sense for the management point of view or development point of view to separate the repo, but I think a more important goal is, as a user, that when you deploy like 1,000 servers with OVS running, so basically you don't want to release that OVS that frequently because you will have a data plane impact, maybe small impact, but usually customer would be more careful about upgrading OVS than upgrading like control plane software like OVN. So I think that would be a more important goal for this separation. If we can do it, we can satisfy this goal without not of difficulty. I think that would be more make more sense.
Okay.
Sorry, we are a big oven shop. This is Girish from NVIDIA. So with that point, right, but oven controller is again on every host where OVS runs. So if we have to upgrade oven controller, there will be some effect to data path, right, because it's the one that's pushing the flows. So if you have to upgrade one version to next version, you will take some hit in terms of the data path for that particular host, correct? So there is kind of, even if you package it separately, I think there will be some effect of on the data path when we upgrade the one control is what I'm saying.
Okay, yeah, we can definitely talk about the data path impact some more. Yeah, if you can bring up the specific concerns, then we can make sure that they're addressed in all of this. Can you
please throw some more, shed more light on Rust and Haskell needs?
Oh,
is it just thing?
Okay, so here's the thing. I'll actually. So this actually has to do with a change coming soon called incremental processing. Han is actually doing a presentation on incremental processing. I'm not sure how much it's going to touch on the Haskell/Rust aspects of it, but it's one of those things that it's going to become a compile time dependency, Haskell and Rust, and then Rust will be a runtime dependency. But the thing is, in the upcoming version of OVS, it'll be optional, I believe, and then starting in some future version, it'll probably become mandatory. And again, that's one of those things where you don't want a configure test to fail because you don't have Haskell installed, and all you're trying to do is install OVS.
But everyone likes performance, and it'll make OVS or OVN run faster.
Yes.
So. All right, so it's been a good discussion, but it's time for lunch. Let's thank our speaker.